This is the biggest hijacking in India's history. It lasted for 8 days and nights. 200 hostages, including the crew, were all threatened with death. Their lives were at constant risk. Every second on screen had me on edge. I couldn't help but hold my breath. It was so tense, words couldn't describe it. It felt like being thrown back into that unforgettable nightmare. Friendly reminder, this is based on true events. It all started on the morning of December 24, 1999. Let's go back to that day. Ram, the first attach at the Indian Embassy, was in Kathmandu, Nepal. He noticed Hashmi, the first attach at the Pakistani Embassy, suspiciously handing a man staying at a guest house a red briefcase. Ram reported this to the Intelligence Bureau. Through wiretapping devices installed at the guest house, he found out they were planning something. At least 3 people were involved. One of them, codenamed Boss, told his partner ANJA, "Even if it takes 200 lives, we'll make it happen." Ram arrested the gang's driver, but the Intelligence Bureau refused to report it, citing insufficient evidence. December 24, 1999. Indian Airlines Flight IC 814 was delayed by several hours. It finally reached Kathmandu. Its destination was Delhi. Passengers were impatiently waiting for the plane to be cleaned, so they could board. The captain complained that he was supposed to fly to Hyderabad. He had told his wife and daughter to wait for him there for a vacation. But at the last minute, he was reassigned to this flight, from Kathmandu to Delhi. He had to call his wife and daughter to reschedule their plans. One of the flight attendants also called home. Her nanny usually left at 6:30 p.m. But with the flight delayed, she had to beg her to stay longer. Otherwise, no one could take care of her father with Alzheimer's. The man with the red briefcase put it in the overhead bin. Hashmi carried a case of weapons through the airport. The security staff were busy chatting. They didn't even notice anything unusual in the case. He passed security with ease and met up with the man codenamed Boss. Most of the passengers on this flight were regular people. A newlywed couple deeply in love, an elderly man with asthma, and a family of 4 on their honeymoon with kids. They were all looking forward to this trip. Ram received intel. Several armed men had boarded the plane. By the time he reached the airport, it was too late. The plane was speeding down the runway. Around PM, it took off and soared into the sky. The moment the landing gear retracted, the real nightmare began. As usual, the captain greeted the passengers over the intercom. From the right windows, they could see the majestic Himalayas. Under the glow of the setting sun, the mountains created a breathtaking view. The flight was expected to reach Delhi in under 2 hours. Just as the flight attendants were serving passengers with the food cart, Boss took out a suitcase. He met up with another man. The hijackers seized the flight crew. Another stormed into the cockpit, weapon raised, shouting, "This plane is now under our control." 3 other hijackers in the cabin heard the commotion. They ordered all passengers to pull down their window shades. Some strong-willed passengers tried to resist, but they were beaten down until they couldn't fight back. The rest didn't dare put up a fight. They followed the hijackers' orders to the letter. The captain, seizing a moment of distraction, secretly sent out the code 7500. This is a transponder code, used during emergencies. It signals air traffic control and ground control of a serious situation. Its specific meaning is unlawful interference, typically indicating a hijacking or the threat of one. The hijackers weren't rattled. One of them picked up the radio and calmly said, "Flight IC 814 has been hijacked. Our destination is Kabul Airport in Afghanistan." Panic swept through the cabin. Passengers buried their fear deep inside. They cautiously watched the hijackers' every move, afraid of becoming their next target. The hijackers made it clear they were determined to complete their mission. They didn't want to hurt anyone, but if anyone tried to interfere, they wouldn't hesitate to use force. At the New Delhi office of India, headlines, journalist Nandi received a tip-off. She learned the inside story of Flight IC-81 for his hijacking. It was guaranteed to make the next day's headlines. Nandi asked her editor and close friend, Sally, to call her uncle at the Intelligence Bureau HQ. Ranjan made the call to report, but with others present in the office, Ranjan didn't dare ask for details openly. Only after finishing the current tasks did he report to the director. The information was passed on to the Intelligence Bureau. It was only then that they began to take Ram's wiretap recordings seriously. Before the hijacking, Ram had tried every possible way to send a warning, but no one paid attention. This indirectly led to over 200 hostages, including the crew, being trapped in a nightmare. Flight attendant Chai was injured during the hijackers' violent actions. Another flight attendant, Rani, was allowed to bring her some medicine to treat her wounds. The two women embraced tightly, unsure how far this danger would spread. Even with a gun pressed tightly against his neck, the captain continued to reassure the passengers over the intercom, urging them to follow the hijackers' instructions. He promised to do everything he could to get everyone home safely. At that moment, the captain thought of his wife and daughter. Perhaps every passenger on board was thinking the same, about the family waiting for them at home, hoping they'd return safely. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs identified a suspect, Masud. He had been a thorn in India's side for over 20 years. After being captured and imprisoned, his followers had attempted to break him out 3 times, all unsuccessful. Could this hijacking be their 4th attempt? There was a problem on the plane. The hijackers demanded to land in Kabul, but there wasn't enough fuel to make the trip. They would have to stop for refueling. The agency contacted Ram, telling him to use every means to interrogate the driver, to find out where the 5 hijackers had been. Masud was moved to a high-security cell, 24, with 24-hour surveillance. Every time the deputy director of the intelligence agency visited, the quality of the tea served improved. This made Masud particularly fond of him. The deputy director tried to get information about the operation, but Masud consistently denied any involvement. From Ram's wiretap, the agency found the name ANJA. He was already on file as an active militant. The question now is ANJA on Flight IC-814? Typically, hijackers are disposable scapegoats. But if someone as important as ANJA is personally involved, then things are far more complicated than they seem. On December 24, 1999, at 5:47 p.m., Intelligence, Investigative Analysis and Crisis Management units formed a special task force. The Foreign Minister was also present. It was confirmed that there were 5 hijackers, armed with knives, guns and grenades. According to Ram's wiretap recordings, ANJA had said, "His brother is trapped there. If the plan fails, it's fine if we take 200 innocent lives with us." ANJA was extremely ruthless. Having previously worked for Pakistan's intelligence agency, he massacred over 400 people in Herat, Afghanistan. The special task force concluded that he was definitely on Flight 814. Based on the aircraft's descent speed, it was determined they couldn't reach Kabul. The hijackers then changed their target, planning to refuel at Lahore airport. Unfortunately, they weren't granted landing permission. Meanwhile, the task force unanimously decided to keep the plane in India. The nearest option was Amritsar airport. Once the plane landed, the National Security Guard could launch an assault. At the same time, they obtained the passenger list. To their surprise, the head of the Nepal intelligence station was also on this flight. An official being hijacked at his own airport was an absolute embarrassment. Everyone agreed to temporarily remove his name from the list and deal with it later. Delhi airport posted delay notices. It had been 3 hours since the hijacking. Information was completely blocked. Relatives had no idea if their loved ones were alive or dead, and the airport refused to comment. Those waiting at the arrival gate were as anxious as ants on a hot pan, but completely helpless. The hijackers agreed to land at Amritsar first, on the condition that a refueling truck was ready. There were only 15 minutes until landing, but the National Security Guard's assault team was 100 kilometers away and would need at least 2 hours to arrive. The only option now is to request assistance from the nearest Punjab police. Deploying the strike team is simple, but giving the order for action is the hard part. That night, the Punjab Chief Minister had gone back to his hometown. The police chief needed his approval before proceeding. At this point, the hijackers started to act. They moved the strong passengers to the front cabin, while the rest were gathered in the back. They separated the newlywed couple in love, forcing an already terrified family to split apart. A pregnant woman was so scared that she had trouble breathing. A flight attendant brought her water and comforted her softly, finally calming her down. Everyone walked with their heads down, hands raised, trembling as they passed through. They were like fish on a chopping block awaiting slaughter. A man with glasses bravely chose his seat, insisting on sitting at the back near the restroom. This way, when the hijackers turned violent, it would be harder for them to notice him in the corner. A mother settled her 2 children and hugged the crying bride to comfort her. Even though her own family's fate was uncertain, she still offered a bit of kindness. This is perhaps what we call the brilliance of human nature. Ram's interrogation of the driver yielded results. Around Ram, he had driven one of the hijackers to someone's house to pick up a red bag. Ram and his partner followed the address. The area was quiet. A man sat silently under the streetlight. Just as Ram knocked on the door, the man suddenly stood up and fired several shots at the driver in the car. The situation was dire. Ram burst into the house, jumped over the back wall, and shot the man chasing him. He and his partner then captured the homeowner. In the midst of the hijacking crisis, the captain, CO pilot, and flight engineer were still working in sync. At 7:15 p.m., they steered the plane onto the Amritsar airport runway. The hijackers demanded the refueling truck arrive within 5 minutes, or they would take off again with empty fuel tanks. Punjab's strike team was deploying around the airport. The hijackers, sensing an ambush, decided to avoid an assault by continuously taxiing around the airport. An elderly man's asthma flared up. Rani looked at him, thinking of her father with dementia back home. Worried, she approached to check on him. The elderly man's inhaler was empty. Rani could only bring him an oxygen tank to help him through the crisis. The eldest son in a family of 4 had a brain condition, which affected his thinking and movement. The husband began to complain, saying they always had to bring him wherever they went. In this emergency, he was even more of a burden. 20 minutes passed, but there was still no sign of the refueling truck on the runway. The hijackers lost their patience, dragging the flight engineer into the cabin. Before his eyes, they struck with knives, gravely injuring 2 innocent passengers. The flight attendants watched the chaos unfold, wanting to help but unsure of what to do. One man, in agony, strained to look back, as if trying to get one last glimpse of his wife. The chief minister refused to allow bloodshed in Punjab, refusing to authorize the special forces to take action. Upon hearing the tragic news from the cabin, the captain shed his usual calm demeanor and angrily shouted into the intercom. 40 minutes passed, and the refueling truck finally arrived. They asked the plane to taxi to the tarmac and shut off the engines for refueling. But the hijackers suspected there was an ambush in the refueling truck and immediately ordered the captain to take off again. Without the chief minister's approval, no one could act. The hijackers gave the captain just 5 seconds to decide: stay and wait for rescue, or follow their orders? In other words, was capturing the hijackers more important, or was protecting the passengers the priority? As each second ticked by, time had never felt so fleeting. At the last moment, the captain made a decisive choice. Flight IC 814 taxied onto the runway and quickly took to the sky. On December 24, 1999, at 7:50 p.m., the first rescue attempt had failed. No one dared to authorize an immediate raid by the special forces. No one wanted to take responsibility. The cabinet secretary of the crisis management group said, "Our job is to assess the situation and find options within the constitutional framework." But the foreign minister disagreed. The constitution was made for the people. The passengers in danger are the ones we must protect. Since we're in these positions, our duty is more than just doing our jobs. The plane had fuel for no more than 10 minutes of flight, and an emergency landing at Lahore, Pakistan was necessary. Back in May 1999, Pakistani forces had attacked Indian troops in Kargil, resulting in heavy casualties. Pakistan's Prime Minister distanced himself from General Musharraf, who had led the attack, and recalled him to the country. Musharraf felt humiliated, and on October 12th overthrew the Prime Minister's government. He declared martial law. The India-Pakistan tensions remained unresolved, and they certainly wouldn't help in this hijacking crisis. As expected, the captain's request to land was denied. Just as they approached the runway, all navigational aids were shut off. The fuel was nearly depleted. The chilling warning sounds tore at the captain's heart. Was he really going to watch the plane crash? The captain made a split-second decision. He turned the plane to prepare for an emergency landing. The location was a dark area up ahead, with no lights, suggesting it was uninhabited. This way, there would be no additional casualties. If luck was on their side, perhaps everyone on the flight could be spared. At that critical moment, the airport received a call from higher authorities. Flight 814 was granted permission to land in Lahore. All navigational aids were turned back on. The plane skimmed just above a residential area, heading toward the airport. One engine had already failed, but the captain still reminded passengers to brace for impact. Without any real preparation, the plane hit the runway with violent turbulence. Everyone's hearts were in their throats. Meanwhile, the two critically injured passengers were in dire condition. As the plane slowed down, everyone finally felt a sense of relief. On December 24, 1999, at 8:10 p.m., Flight 814 landed at Lahore Airport. A doctor among the passengers checked on the critically injured. The groom needed to be taken to a hospital immediately. An elderly man's oxygen tank was also running out, but there was no extra oxygen available on the plane. The captain stared blankly at the chaos in the cabin. After a long silence, he finally muttered, "Someone has to be able to help us, right?" After refueling, the captain pleaded with the hijackers to let the two critically injured passengers off the plane. But the response he received was, "More people will die later. How many can you save?" At 9:30 p.m., Flight 814 took off again, still under hijacker control. Meanwhile, the National Security Agency escorted the captain's wife and daughter home. Journalists crowded the entrance, demanding answers, asking why the captain didn't wait longer in Amritsar. The hijackers demanded the plane land at Kabul airport, but there were no night landing facilities there. The earliest they could land was at M. However, the plane only had enough fuel for 4 hours of flight, but RM was still 7 hours away. The hijackers decided to make an interim landing at Dubai airport. Dubai is part of the UAE, and the UAE followed the direction of the United States. Just a year and a half before this hijacking, India was criticized for conducting nuclear tests, with the US being the first to impose economic sanctions. Old grievances remained, so the foreign minister had to rely on personal connections to seek their help. He managed to get permission for the plane to land at Dubai airport and got the hijackers to release the women and children. After negotiations, on December 25, 1999, at 1:20 am, the plane was allowed to enter Dubai's Minhad Air Base. Following the hijackers' instructions, only 2 people were allowed to refuel the plane. Someone needed to take the blame for the failed operation in Amritsar. Naturally, the captain became the scapegoat. Most of the public criticism targeted him, saying he wasn't brave enough. He didn't wait for the security forces to arrive. Even his young daughter, could understand the accusations against him. But why? Her father was doing everything he could to protect others. So why was it still considered wrong? But there are always those with courage. When the public was all against him, journalist Nandi stood firm and published an article, arguing that the captain shouldn't have waited in Amritsar. The pilot manual clearly states to follow the hijackers' instructions, to ensure the safety of those on board. Where was he wrong? Just because most people condemned him, does that make it right? If it's expected, does it make it just? The UAE made a demand to the hijackers to release the women, children, and injured passengers. Otherwise, they wouldn't remove the fuel hose. Initially, the hijackers refused, but the officer in charge, who was from Pakistan, recited a verse from the Quran. He who kills one person is like he killed all of humanity, and he who saves one life is like he saved all of humanity. The hijackers were furious, but bound by their faith, they had no choice but to comply. At AM, the women and children were allowed off the plane. Some refused to leave their families behind, giving up their rare chance of escape. A flight attendant, injured, was granted permission to disembark, but he chose to give his spot to someone else. Ordinary people can also show extraordinary courage. For them, this job had become more than just work, it was a duty, or perhaps a mission to ensure every passenger got home safely. The groom succumbed to his injuries, and his body was heartlessly tossed out of the cabin by the hijackers. He turned and told the two flight attendants, "You're lucky to be alive and happy. That's why you think death is such a tragedy." Flight 814's next destination was now Afghanistan. This brought Mullah Omar into the picture. In 1996, he declared himself the supreme leader of Afghanistan, with dreams of uniting Islamic nations and establishing an Islamic emirate recognized worldwide. But things didn't go as planned. After realizing his atrocities, most countries severed ties with him. On the second day of the hijacking, the hijackers changed course, demanding the plane land at Kandahar airport. They allowed passengers to use the restroom and promised that food would soon be served by the attendants. After hours of exhaustion, the captain finally got a brief moment to rest. The bride was still asking about the groom's whereabouts. A man hesitantly replied that he hadn't noticed. She shouted the groom's name, her anxious voice echoing through the cabin. The man then quietly told his wife that the groom had been killed by the hijackers. But how could they tell the bride that all her hopes and dreams had been shattered? The special task force reached out to the Taliban's foreign minister, Katyal. He was only 32 years old and had become Mullah Omar's bridge to other nations. Katyal stationed armed militants outside, and after meeting ANJA and the others, he had them remain on the plane to guard the hostages. 24 hours after the hijacking began, the Indian Prime Minister issued a statement strongly condemning the barbaric act. The cabinet decided that India would not negotiate with the hijackers. The man codenamed Boss became furious, demanding the Taliban fully refuel the plane so they could crash it into the Indian Parliament building. So far, the hijackers hadn't made any demands. They had released around 30 hostages by then. People were both relieved and worried about the fate of those still on the plane. The captain's wife released a statement saying she firmly believed her husband would return alive. But of course, the remaining hostages would have to return safely as well. She asked Nandi, "Who will be the first shot in this hijacking? Who will take the first bullet in the commando operation? And who has ensured the plane landed safely each time?" The answer was always the same: the captain. If the Prime Minister refused to negotiate, it would be the innocent who suffered. The question now shouldn't be about blame or punishment, but why 200 people were being forced to suffer, and what should be done next? December 26, 1999, the third day of the hijacking. The bathroom had become clogged from constant use. The stench filled the entire cabin. Rani opened the door for some fresh air without permission, only to be slapped hard by ANJA. Days of pent-up frustration overwhelmed her. The two flight attendants hugged tightly, tears streaming down before words could form. The captain suggested dumping fuel to prevent takeoff, but the CO pilot refused to be part of the plan. He had a family, children. They were his strength, but also his weakness. Even for his family, he was willing to stay alive at all costs. After the CO pilot stepped back, the captain and flight engineer began their operation. They held their breath, waiting, not daring to make a mistake. As the fuel tank neared full, the captain hit the button to dump all the fuel. ANJA was initially suspicious and beat the captain harshly, but eventually believed the excuse that the plane had malfunctioned. The captain successfully bought some time. An delegation was sent to negotiate with the hijackers. India's Press Information Bureau held a press conference. Someone burst in, accusing them of inaction, saying no effective measures had been taken since the hijacking began. They hadn't even gathered specific information on the hijackers. A reporter questioned Mutawakil, asking why the hijackers had chosen Kandahar and how Mutawakil had been able to supply so much food and water to the hostages in such a short amount of time. Did he have some kind of foreknowledge? December 27, 1999, the fourth day of the hijacking, Rani asked ANJA to let her call home to check in, saying if her father answered, it would at least prove he was still alive. As she spoke, Rani couldn't hold back her tears. Her distant family was her deepest concern. The Indian Prime Minister still refused to compromise. But rules are rigid, people are not. The Special Task Force selected 4 skilled negotiators, experienced and persuasive, to go to Kandahar. A few hours earlier, Ram, through the captured homeowner, finally discovered that the red bag contained explosives, 17 kilograms, enough to blow the entire plane to pieces. The 4-person team's mission was not only to negotiate with the hijackers, but to find the explosives as soon as possible. The negotiators learned about the situation inside the cabin and suggested that the exhausted bride be let off the plane first. She hadn't eaten or drunk anything and was in terrible condition. The hijacker, codenamed Boss, refused to release any more people and said that, if necessary, they would kill more passengers. The negotiator calmly made a suggestion, then kill them. You have 170 Indian hostages, but India has over 5,000 of your people. Let's see who loses more. There was silence from the other side for a while. Clearly, they were rattled and didn't know how to respond. The negotiator cleverly bought time, suggesting they continue negotiations the next day. It was a time-buying tactic. In negotiations, it's about who is more desperate. The more anxious side is likely to lower their demands. On the other hand, the calmer side usually gains the upper hand. December 28, 1999, the 5th day of the hijacking. The restroom was completely blocked, and the stench spread throughout the cabin. The man who had asked to sit in the corner couldn't take it anymore. He asked to change seats, but the hijackers weren't going to indulge him. Wasn't this the special treatment he fought for at the start? Since he liked being clever, he should deal with the consequences himself. Today's negotiations were slow to start. The hijackers were growing impatient. They threw down a doll with a note inside. The note listed their demands. First, release 35 prisoners from their list. Second, return Sajjad's body. Third, prepare $200 million. Sajjad was one of their own. Killed 6 months ago. He had already been properly buried. But the hijackers believed it was on impure land, with an impure ceremony. They insisted on bringing his body back for burial at home. The $200 million demand was also suspicious. Converted to Pakistani rupees, it amounted to billions. If they really needed money, they could easily rob a bank. Why go to all this trouble? Clearly, someone must have instructed them to make these demands. And these unreasonable demands were likely meant to conceal their real intentions. Sure enough, after reviewing the prisoners' identities, they found the real target, Massoud. But Massoud didn't seem surprised. He had too many followers. Just like in the previous prison break attempts, he didn't even know the initiators. But people had come from as far as London, willing to sacrifice their lives to save him. If you asked Massoud for a list of suspects, he wouldn't know where to begin. December 29, 1999, the sixth day of the IC-81 for hijacking, the negotiation team coaxed the hijackers into revealing the person they most wanted freed. The boss was about to ask for his brother Massoud's release, but ANJA was cautious. He told him to tell the negotiators that everyone on the list must be freed. These criminals were captured at great risk. It would be tough for India to agree to such a demand. If they released them, wouldn't it mean the martyrs had died in vain? Would that be fair to them and their families? But if they didn't comply with the hijackers' demands, would they just give up on the 170 plus passengers? Were their lives worth nothing? After deliberating, the Special Task Force had the negotiators relay the terms they were willing to accept. They could only release Massoud and four others. The other two conditions were void. But this uncompromising stance only angered the hijackers. They threw the radio aside, refusing to communicate further. There was one problem. There were 17 kilograms of explosives on the plane. It should have been a significant bargaining chip. But through all the negotiations, why hadn't the boss mentioned it? It's believed that even he didn't know about the explosives. The organization behind ANJA would never accept failure. That's why ANJA personally arranged for the explosives, as a last resort in case the negotiations failed. The rest of the hijackers were merely cannon fodder. It seemed like the boss was leading the negotiations, but in reality, ANJA was the mastermind. That would explain everything. December 30, 1999, the seventh day of the hijacking. One passenger handed over his account information to the hijackers, begging them to give it to his wife. But the hijackers tore up the note. One of them patted him on the shoulder, as if to console him. The hijackers refused to speak with the negotiation team. The situation had reached a stalemate. They needed a breakthrough. The negotiators soon focused on Foreign Minister Mutawar. At just 32, he spoke fluent English. If given the choice, he would certainly choose a better city, rather than being stuck here. So the negotiators made a deal with him. They leveraged his career and the future development of the region. Mutawar quickly agreed to the terms. He personally negotiated with the hijackers, finally convincing them to give up the money and Sajjad's body. They agreed to release only Massoud and four other prisoners. Two of them were notorious war criminals. Releasing them would undoubtedly stir up more trouble. The Special Task Force would be blamed, and go down in history with infamy for this. But the foreign minister had this to say: before you raise a gun to take a life, think carefully. But when you're saving a life, don't hesitate for even a second. So, when it comes to saving lives, every condition must give way to that. December 31, 1999, the eighth day of the IC-81 for hijacking. India and the hijackers reached an agreement. The 17 kilograms of explosives were removed from the plane, and the remaining 170 plus survivors were freed. As he left, the captain glanced at the chaos inside the cabin. After 8 days of tension, his emotions finally broke. He hid away, sobbing uncontrollably. It was for himself, for his family, and for all those innocent people who had been trapped. The Special Task Force's predictions were spot on. 3 of the released criminals went on to plan the 2008 Mumbai attacks and the 2019 Pulwama attack, among others. The casualties were devastating. If the Special Task Force could go back to that day in 1999, would they still make the same choice? There were many plot points in the show left unexplained, like the red patterned bag seen at the beginning, and the briefcase Hashmi was carrying. Neither appeared again later in the story. It's assumed that both contained weapons for the hijackers. Otherwise, how do you explain that each hijacker had a gun during the hijacking? They didn't just fall from the sky. Well, technically, they were already in the sky. But there's another issue. How did these weapons slip past security? It's easy to see that the security officers were distracted, turning around to chat with colleagues. But this raises a rather chilling suspicion. Why did it happen so perfectly that the security officer turned away just as the weapons passed through? Not only did the hijackers get through easily, but it also distracted his colleagues. Was that really just a coincidence? We know that people like ANJA and Hashmi have powerful forces behind them. They have countless subordinates. So, is it possible that this security officer was part of the plan too? It's unlikely to be a coincidence, because if something had gone wrong during security checks, the entire plan would have collapsed. They wouldn't have taken such a huge risk. The original show was full of open and hidden critiques, each more biting than the last, but it's hard to speak about them from a personal standpoint. It was shot in a semi-documentary style, featuring a lot of historical footage. If you're interested, you should check out the original series, especially the hijacking scenes. They're really intense.